I'm Mo Cooper. I'm a local community historian and member of Fauna. And today I'm contributing to the Fauna Bites with a short talk about St Anns Allotments. I'm particularly going to talk about how we researched the project over a pretty much 10-year period and what we found in the archives that helped us uncover the history of this site. I'm going to particularly be looking at the Victorian and Edwardian time period, as the overall history is a much longer talk. Before I start, I'd just like to visit the site. This is a Google Earth screenshot. You can see it's quite a large area, 75 acres. It's on the border of St Anns and Mapley, but very much an inner city site. It's 3 gardens: Hunger Hill Gardens, Gorsey Gardens and Stone Pit Coppice, but the 3 of them together are now referred to as St Anns Allotments. And here we have the first document that we acquired from the archives. It's a lease for a couple of acres of land on the Hunger Hills that was being used for agriculture, dated 1305. And this shows that that area of St Anns was being used for agriculture for at least 700 years. But the story started to get a bit more interesting from about 1605, when we read in the council day books that 30 burgesses of the town of Nottingham were allocated land on the Hunger Hills. This land would have been about 2 or 3 acres each. They paid for it, it was leased to them. They would grow crops, some of them had animals, some of them had orchards. And this carried on for quite a few hundred years, with different burgesses taking on their allocation of land. But this picture, which comes from Picture the Past, captures a moment in time when things started to change. The picture's not dated, but we think it's about 1830. At the time, and what we can see at the back is the rolling hills of the Hunger Hills. This would have been the typical Burgess parts, not necessarily divided in any way, following ancient pathways and roads at the time. But at the front we can start seeing that there's more formal gardens being installed. There's little hedges being put in. People have started to build summer houses and glass houses. And this was because at the beginning of the 19th century, the burgesses started to subdivide their gardens into smaller gardens of about 500 square yards. And they would rent these to people who lived in Nottingham. Prior to enclosure, Nottingham would have been very, very crowded. You may be cash rich, but you'd be space poor. So you bought a garden in the countryside. And at that point in time, St Anns was the countryside. This we know started from about 1812, that's the first evidence we've found, and by 1830 we have at least 400 gardens on the Hunger Hills alone. We have a lovely description by Howard of how the gardens were presenting in about 1830. We then go up a sort of narrow lane, just wide enough to let a cart pass along. And then from this, at rather long intervals, start off other lanes, much narrower. Indeed, only about 4 feet between the lines of hedges. The entrances of these minor arteries are all closed by doors, locked, to which every tenant has a key. Going down one of these lanes, you pass right and left, about every 20 yards, a door leading into a garden. The hedge is from 7 to 9 feet high and frequently carried over the door in the form of an arch. Now, I say these words were from Howard in the 1830s, but the pictures are all from today. Not a lot has changed from the original layout of the 1830s. So these new gardens were called leisure gardens, town gardens, detached gardens, guinea gardens, lots of different ideas. But the notion is that these were private gardens and not used as typical allotments. because it would cost you sometimes up to a pound a year to rent them. And what these new tenants who were taking on these gardens were after was typically the 3 Ps of Victorian gardening, which was about privacy, pleasure and peace. As you see, they would all have their own front gate, and inside they would quite often build very nice summer houses and glass houses. Again, we have a description from Howard. Many are very picturesque rustic huts, built with great taste, and hidden by tall hedges in a perfect little paradise of lawn and shrubbery. Most delightful spots to go and read on a summer day, or to take a dinner or tea in with a pleasant party of friends. As you can see, the people here are not dressed for gardening. They're dressed for entertainment. They've been invited to have a look at somebody's garden. Pleasant party of friends. Not a very happy group of friends, except for the guy in the middle, maybe. But this gives you a sort of moment of entertainment within the gardens. And STAA has recreated this idea of the Victorian garden up at the allotments so that people can come and visit. You'll see from this picture that it's a well set out garden, very grand glass house. Big path so you can perambulate around the garden. Mainly a flower garden. They may grow vegetables, but the vegetables have to be attractive. So maybe some rhubarb or some chard. What you don't want to be seeing is rows and rows of potatoes. And again, we've got a lovely description from Howard. Substantial brick-built houses with glass windows, good cellars for a deposit of choice wines, a kitchen, all necessary apparatus, and a good pump to supply them with water. This is a particularly well-known picture of the allotments that's been around for quite a long time. Again, picture the past of Mr. and Mrs. Bell at their summer house at the gardens. But by the mid to late 19th century, things started to change up at the Hunger Hills. There were many factors that related to this. First was enclosure in Nottingham in 1845 and extension of the boroughs in the 1870s. So now we have a situation where the middle classes started moving out of the town into the suburbs, where they had their own garden attached to their house, so they no longer needed a detached garden over at the Hunger Hills. And by the 1880s, we start seeing St Anns being developed as an area for the artisan class, for the skilled working class people. And they started taking on gardens at the allotments. You can see again from this picture that the people here are dressed for work. They're not dressed purely for leisure. So we've got the late 19th century, early 20th century. This is the heyday of allotment mania, a great movement to get the working classes onto the land, onto allotments, growing their own food. We had people like the Reverend Orange in Nottingham who were at the forefront of publicising this idea. Not only was it a great thing for the working classes to have access to these gardens, it was the general philosophy that it would keep them occupied and keep them out of the pub. Now, whilst it would be presumed that these new tenants would be particularly keen to grow food to support their family, what's very clear at St Anns was that many of the people were growing flowers as well. Some of them were selling their flowers on. And St Anns was particularly well known for the horticultural shows, and particularly the St Anns Rose Show that started in the mid-19th century, went on right through to the 1980s. Now, quite early on, we found the records of the Bridge Estates. This is part of Nottingham Council, but it was a trust that was set up to raise funds, actually, to maintain the bridge over the River Trent. Within it, we found a list of tenants at the allotments from the 1870s and another list from the 1903. From this, we could start looking at census information and trade directories, and we started to form images and pictures of many of the tenants that were at the gardens, and we did find, surprisingly, that there were as many middle class tenants still there as there were working class tenants. What we also found is a number of the tenants actually lived in their little summer houses. This screen actually shows some papers that we found at the archives. It was the personal papers of John Himes, dated from the beginning of the 20th century. Himes was a bootmaker, had a business on Drury Hill, obviously very successful. His father had been a boot manufacturer too. And he kept all his papers, not just of his business, but also about his gardens. And we found that he had 2 gardens on Stone Pit Coppice. The picture on the top right there, which you can't see so clearly, is actually him purchasing one of the gardens from another tenant at the cost of £8. But we also had lots of invoices that he kept from all his orders. And we can see here someone who spent a lot of money on his garden. Very much a leisure garden, very much a flower garden, so reminiscent of the original Victorian gardens that we were looking at. We can get a picture of how his garden would have looked by these invoices. So we can imagine 17 different varieties of chrysanthemum on one invoice. There was an invoice for turf, so he clearly had a lawned area. My particular favourite is a bill from J.R. Pearson and Sons for 100 snowdrops, 100 English iris, 150 St Bridget and Anemone, and 100 Narcissus Agnes Bar. So the gardeners among you would know these flowers and know that this man is planning a beautiful display for spring. We found some other strange invoices in there as well. There were lots of memberships, so Nottinghamshire Horticultural and Botanical Society, the Chrysanthemum Society, and the North Road Championship Club, which we found was a pigeon fancying club. Now today, a lot of people use the internet to access lots of records from the past. But when we started this project, it was about 2008. So we spent a lot of time at the archives and indeed the local studies library looking up documents. Even a year ago, before lockdown, we would still be at the archives accessing Ancestry UK and newspapers online via the computers there. And we collected a lot of information, discovered lots of stories, some sad, some hilarious. So we've got stories of murder, suicide, theft, outrages at the Hunger Hills, lots of memories, information about new communities, old oral history projects. We even found evidence that Dame Laura Knight had a family connection with the Hunger Hills. Her uncle Arthur had a plot there, and there's a lovely letter that actually describes a visit to the gardens. There's just so many stories that we're still discovering 10 years on. And I wish I had the time to share more of them with you, maybe another time. But I just wanted to talk a little bit about how history doesn't need to be stale. There's people behind it all. And by using the facilities that we have in Nottingham, we can come up with some fantastic information about the past. Today, STAA, which is the charity that carries out a number of community activities on site and looks after the heritage, including the heritage garden and wildlife. They provide lots of opportunities for visiting the site, not so much in 2020, though we did manage a few tours, so we were quite pleased with that. And we are available for talks about the wildlife or the heritage or different stories about the gardens. We can do that virtually or online. Hopefully early 2021 we should have a virtual tour on our website as well. We also have opportunities for volunteering if you want to get out and about into fresh air this winter. There's also possibilities for further research on the history or to deliver talks or tours if anybody's interested. So I've just popped up the contact details on the screen here. If you'd like any more information about the allotments, to go and visit or get involved as a volunteer, then please contact STAA direct. Don't contact me, please. I've put my details up as well in case you're interested in any of the walks and talks that I do in Nottingham that are not to do with the allotments. And I hope you found the talk interesting. It's been interesting for me just to talk to a screen, not to human beings. And I also hope that maybe it's given you a thought about what you could get out of the archives that would flavour your history research a bit more. That sort of story about the humans and the amount of strange little boxes that are sitting in the archives that we still have to discover. But for now, thanks for listening. I've been Mo Cooper from Nottingham.